I'm convinced you're all having a fabulous time at this conference because you can't come and not have a fabulous time. But now we get to put our brains to work thinking about numbers. I think whenever I've attended conferences like this, it's really fun to talk about production. Oh man, you get your brain is just expanding. It's like, oh, I can do anything. And then you get home and you're like, oh, how am I going to do this? What is it all going to look like at the end? So we're going to have a little bit of a reality check right here this morning. My name, again, is Jody Padgham, and I was, up until last night, I just officially retired as the coordinator of the American Pastured Poultry Producers Association. But I am also the financial manager of the Midwest Organic and Sustainable Education Service, which is MOSES, which is basically a sister organization to what I call Pasa, which I realize is not the right way you're supposed to pronounce that. But everybody else says it different than I do. But and we're headquartered in Wisconsin and also do educational programming. We have a big conference at the end of the month. And my contact information is on there. And the reason that I'm here talking to you today is that about 3 years ago, our board of directors in one of their regular meetings was doing brainstorming about what our organization can do to really help farmers succeed, specifically sustainable and organic farmers. And we've got a board that's a majority of farmers themselves. And in the conversation, it just became clear that its financial sustainability is one of the biggest stumbling blocks once a farmer gets started. That you can get started and get going, and then all of a sudden you hit that 3, 5, 10-year level, and you're just overwhelmed with work and underwhelmed with money. And that there somehow has to be some planning that goes in to make that not happen, to farmers be able to make it past that hump. And so we took it upon ourselves to help with that. And in the past 2.5 years, I've been working with 3 colleagues to create this book. And it just came out. Pasa is our first venue to sell it. And we made it accessible. It's only $19.95. We are selling it downstairs at the Pasa booth. But we really have tried to take complicated financial concepts and simplify them in a way that are accessible to you. So if the things that we talk about today are intriguing to you and you'd like to explore more, I really do recommend picking up the book. But before I go too much longer, well, I also have to say that I too am a farmer. I have a 60-acre grass-based farm in central Wisconsin that I've owned for 10 years, where I raise sheep and organic pastured poultry. So let's just start a little bit about who you are. Who here would like to make a profit farming? Well, you laugh. Some people don't. Who thinks they're making a profit farming? Who knows they're making a profit farming? We have 4 people that know they're making a profit farming. That is great, that there's some people that know they're making a profit farming. Who uses a computer bookkeeping system? Oh, good. I like to see that. I live in very rural Derry, Wisconsin, and I think I probably own the only computer for about 4 square miles. But my neighbors are very financially savvy people, and so you can very easily succeed successfully in financial management not owning a computer. And I've got lots of friends that can testify to that. But with the age of computers, we're finding that you can get so much more information by using a computer, and you can get it very quickly on the analytical side. The input side, I don't think you're saving a whole lot of time, but on the analytical side, you are. And there's a lot of resources to help get you set up with a computer and a computer bookkeeping program. In the book, we have examples from several farmers that use several different bookkeeping programs. So if you're a little stymied about which one might work, there's lots of resources to find things. And also, I want to mention that feel free to interrupt me with questions if you'd like to, because we're going to kind of roar along here. So the first thing to think about as you think about financial, given the title of our presentation, which is Collecting and Assessing Farm Numbers to Meet Financial Goals, Set Prices, and Balance Your Product Mix. I didn't write that title, but it's very comprehensive. And so the first thing, how are we going to meet our financial goals? Well, you got to set some financial goals. So what are your financial goals in your farm? What do you want your farm to accomplish in your life? And I know when I bought my farm, I had these great ambitions. I'm a single woman, I'm 50 years old, and I buy a 60-acre farm, and I'm going to raise dairy sheep, and I'm going to make a living. I'm thinking, now it's 10 years later, and now those are my hens in my yard there, and I'm a very significant hobby farmer now because I've realized that my goals have to fit my life. I was too ambitious. It was just not going to work. And you should feel okay if what you end up being is a hobby farmer. It's great to want to make a living as a sustainable farmer, and I don't want to discourage you from doing that. But if it doesn't work with your life, just be okay with not having it be that way. So you can have your farming enterprise be the majority of your income. You can have it, each enterprise, you can have sheep, you can have chickens, you can have milk, you can have different things and lots of different enterprises. You can have an off-farm job to support it. You can just have a farm just because it's fun, just because you want to create food, or you just like being on the farm. So what are the things that are going to vary depending on the reasons that you're farming? And these occur on both ends. So the things that you want to look at, what are your limitations with labor? What are your limitations with land or space or infrastructure? How much money do you have to invest in a farming operation? What kind of markets do you have access to? What are the tax implications? Do you have other income that's going to be coming into the farm that'll help support your farm? And what are some of the other considerations? Again, I do pastured poultry in Wisconsin, and I live 2.5 hours from a processing plant, and I do all my processing on farm. And in Wisconsin, I'm limited to 2,000 birds. That's all I can do if home processing. So that pretty much limits my scale unless I'm going to go and drive to a processor. And just about everybody has something going on with their operation. And then this last one, which may seem trivial, but do you really like doing the kind of farming that you're doing? Because farming is a very consuming occupation, and you better like it if you're going to be doing it. So let's just look at it numerically. Now that you've got a little bit of an idea in your head, well, I want to be a full-time dairy farmer. As you're thinking about it, and some of you are probably already farming, some of you might not yet be farming. So we're just going to assume that this is part of either a beginning planning process or an ongoing planning process. Say you want to make $40,000 a year, which you could either go and get a job at the, public library. Who gets paid $40,000 a year these days? I'm not quite sure. But if you want to bring a net income of $40,000, then let's say you raise pastured poultry. Well, it's not unreasonable to think that you're going to make $7 per chicken doing pastured poultry. So if you do the math, that means you have to raise 5,714 chickens. And once you sit down at your kitchen table and you think, well, what is it going to take to raise 5,714 chickens? I'm going to tell you it's going to take a lot of different pieces of things. You're going to have to decide on a production system. If you're going to have pens, you're going to have a certain number of pens. You're going to need a certain amount of land. You're going to need somebody to help you. This is a kind of sitting down you're going to have to do, the planning ahead of time so that you can scale your operation appropriately for what your resources and your limitations are and what your goals are. I think I've worked with farmers for many, many years, and you see a lot of people, they start off with these grand ambitions. As part of the poultry group, I answered the telephone for many, many years, and you always get these calls from people that say, well, I just decided to start raising poultry, and I'm going to raise 2,000 broilers this year. and you just think, wow, this person just doesn't have their hands on reality at all. What is that going to take? And then they've got this business plan that's based on this income that is just not realistic at all. So I just have to reinforce that. And you might wonder, if you are going to be doing this kind of planning, where are these numbers going to come from? And this is where your extension agents will really come in handy, is that land-grant universities and extension has done a lot of good work at publishing numbers about yields and prices, but again, they're going to be averages. It's interesting because my colleague Chris Blanchard is across the way, and he knows vegetable operations very well, and he says that the published data says that your yield on an acre of vegetable farms is anywhere from $4,000 to $35,000. Well, how are you supposed to do planning on that? If you are going to do planning, just pick a middle number and see where the numbers go from there. So I want to get across a really important concept here, which is that there's a real difference between profit and profitability. And as you're doing your financial planning or your financial analysis, it's pretty exciting at the end of the year when you can look at your income and you can look at your expenses and you can even it out, you can add it up and you can say, wow, I made a profit at the end of the year. Well, that's your number one goal. But your number two goal is to have a profitable operation. And what that means is that you've got enough money so that you can take a vacation, you can send the kids to college, you can buy health insurance, and you can have the kind of operation that your kids or another person will want to move into when you're done. That's a much bigger goal when you think about it. And if you can find other things off the farm, such as an off-farm job, to support that, that's great. But if you're going to be a full-time farmer, it's something you need to put into your consideration as you're planning. So now that you know how important it is to be looking at your numbers and knowing what your goals are, assessing your goals, how are you going to know if you're meeting your goals? And one way to understand what's going on with your farm is to do something called an enterprise analysis. And what that is splitting your farm into pieces so that you can track exactly what's going on financially within a certain production stream. For instance, on my farm, I have broilers, I have turkeys, and I have sheep. And I can look at the economics of each of those pieces independently, because as a whole, maybe you're bringing in a slight profit, and it's less than what you're thinking. It's very likely that one operation on your farm is doing better than another operation on your farm. And there's a lot of reasons you might have a diversity of operations on your farm, but having that concrete information of what each piece of the operation is bringing to the total helps you make really educated decisions about why you're doing what you're doing, what you might want to change. There's a lot of reasons. One of the people that I interviewed, she has a diversified orchard that the majority of their money comes from organic apples and cider. But they also grow strawberries. And she says strawberries don't make a lot of money for them, but it's a really good product for them because it brings them into the stores early in the season. It gives their staff time to get settled in the spring so that they understand some of the systems, and that it just keeps their label in their customers' eyes. So what the process that we're going to go through today to look at our numbers doesn't mean it's the be-all and end-all about deciding about what to grow on your farm, but it gives you the base of information so that you're making knowledgeable decisions. Doing an enterprise analysis is also going to give the information so that you can assess whether you're charging the right prices or not, and you're also going to be able to get some tools so that you can see compare different options if you're thinking about making changes. Those are the beef cows that live on my farm. So you might think if you're already farming, well, I only do a couple things. But a lot of people do a lot more things than they're really thinking that they're doing. And when I'm talking about enterprises, you can split them in different ways. For instance, on my farm, I sell, again, sheep, and I sell live lambs, and I sell cut meat, and then I sell cull sheep. And I can either lump sheep as a group with all of those things together, or I can look at each one independently. So that's up to you. This tool is going to be useful on many different levels. As you understand how to use it, you can decide what the context is that you're going to put it in. So, for instance, a dairy farm might sell milk, calves, heifers, cows, steers, hay, corn, mixed vegetable, salad mix, green beans, sweet corn, tomatoes. There's my farm and the third one. But you could also do assessments by your market type. If you're kind of thinking, well, do I make more money at the farmer's market, or would I make more money selling to a nursing home? So you can use this tool for that as well. This is a very simple example of my enterprise analysis that I did last year. And again, this is very simplified. It can get way more complex than this, and I just want to talk about the elements of what you could do to put into an analysis like this, and then take it back to your farm and do things more completely. Those of you that are using bookkeeping programs on your computer, this information should be fairly accessible to you. We'll talk a little bit more about how to split it by enterprise. If you're not already collecting this information, if you want to use this tool, you're going to have to sit down and start collecting some information. It doesn't have to go into a computer. You could just use it in a written spreadsheet or an Excel spreadsheet on the computer. So again, on my farm, this year I raised 225 broilers and 17 turkeys on pasture. And you can see what I did with this chart is compare what was happening with the broilers to what was happening with the turkeys. And you have this chart on your handout. So let's look at what goes into this. What we're going to be doing is comparing what happened. Well, primarily in enterprise analysis, as I was thinking about this morning, I thought primarily what you're doing is you're collecting the expenses of each enterprise, because the income is going to be very much based on your particular market. And so there's a couple different ways to use this tool, and one way would be, because your production expenses are going to be your production expenses no matter how you market, right? There's a certain place where everything is going to stay the same. For me, it changes with my lambs, whether I'm driving that lamb to my meat processor or whether I'm hiring someone to drive that lamb to the live auction. That's where things start to change. For you, if you're a vegetable operation, it's from when you're picking and packing to go to the farmer's market, or whether you're picking and packing to sell to the institution or the retail. So collecting the numbers at some point are going to be consistent, and then you're going to start to see some changes, and you're going to just want to take the one group, the second group, and start to add the differences down at the bottom. So let's just look for right now what's going to go into that generalized thing. Let's skip the income for now. Actually, and I'm going to skip the labor for now, too. Let's look at inputs. So what does it take to produce? What kind of things are you adding in? Perhaps you're buying plant starch, you're buying fertilizer. For me, I'm buying chicks. You might be buying hay, you might be buying corn. The important thing to think about this is how much of each input are you giving, generating, using for each enterprise. In my case, I buy chicks and then I buy baby turkeys. It's very easy for me to look at how much it costs for the chicks and how much it costs for the turkeys and separate it. The feed is a little bit more complicated, because when I go out in the morning, I've got 2 buckets of feed. I've got a bulk bin with 2,000 pounds, and I just go in and I put the feed in the buckets, and I take 1 bucket to the turkeys and 1 bucket to the chicks. Ideally, what you would do is you would measure how much feed is going into each enterprise, and you would keep a chart of that. And it's going to change throughout the season. You can't just say, oh, I gave them 35 pounds every day for the last 35 days. You would want to change. Ideally, you would want to measure. I didn't measure when I was doing this. I was just I sat there in my kitchen and I went, well, I think I give about 10 pounds to the turkeys and I give about 40 pounds to the chicks. And so I'm just going to say that it's a ratio of this percent to that percent. And at this, I was feeding the turkeys some different feed at the beginning, but I took that into account. So for the first few times that you're doing this, don't be intimidated if you don't have that detail. The better the detail, obviously the better your numbers, the better your decision making is going to be, but just for rough guesses are okay. Again, seeds, fertilizers, those are all things that you're going to want to put in there. So let's talk about labor, which is the bottom chart here. This is one of the more complex things to talk about in an analysis like this, because how many of you actually know how much time you spent weeding beets last year? You know, yeah, you do. Good. or moving the sheep from one pasture to another, or you just don't. But if you really want this tool to work for you, it would be great if you designed a system so that you know how to keep track of this. And people are all going, oh my God, farming used to be fun. Now I have to do all this kind of stuff. But if you just set up a simple chart like this on the bottom, where every day you write down and put this someplace where you're going to use it, and where the people that are working with you are going to use it, every day you write down. First of all, you have to figure out ahead of time, obviously, which enterprises you're going to track. Don't track beets if all you're going to do is farmers market sales. Just then track whatever your vegetable time is. You don't want to overtake information. And since I was tracking broilers and turkeys, I just track how much time I put into broilers and how much time to turkeys. And again, if you're pretty much doing the same thing every day and you can average it, that's okay. Just put in any exceptional time and come up with a total at the end. Now, those of you that are filing farm taxes or doing your bookkeeping, you're going to say, well, I don't pay myself for my time, so why does that matter? Well, yeah, you don't pay yourself, but when you're pricing your products, don't you want the value of your time to be in there? Don't you want to get paid for your time? So if you want to get paid for your time, you want to price your products so that they reflect the amount of time that you're putting into the product. So and then the question comes up, well, how much am I worth? Well, I came up for mine with $10 an hour. And yeah, my work at Moses, I get paid a lot more than that. I'd probably quit my job if I didn't. But in my community, in rural central Wisconsin, actually $10 an hour, people think that is like more than great to get paid $10 an hour for farm labor. It's more like $8 an hour. But I'm generous and I pay, when I have somebody help me, I pay her $10 an hour. So come up with a figure that you feel is fair for the work that you're doing or the work that your family's doing. And again, don't scrimp on this number. Everybody wants to say, oh, I didn't really do that much. It's like, no, you need to get paid for what you're doing. So put that in. Does anybody have questions about that? On the top here is just an example for those that do use a bookkeeping system, or even if you're using a paper system, just to keep track as your expenses come in. For instance, if you go to the feed store, and if I was going to go to the feed store, I'd probably buy some new fence posts for the sheep, and I might buy a block of mineral or a block of salt for the sheep, and I might buy maybe a new feed trough for the chickens. When I get home and I record that expense, I just record the expenses related to the particular enterprise in the particular column. It's pretty straightforward. It sounds straightforward. It takes a lot of time. The next more complicated piece is the equipment. Because on our farm, for instance, if you're a diversified vegetable farmer, maybe you use a tractor to cultivate or to distribute manure or to plow in the beginning of the spring or whatever. But you probably didn't buy that tractor solely to do the work on the vegetable operation. Maybe you did. Hopefully, if you're a small farmer, you didn't. And so there's pieces of equipment on the farm that are either dedicated to this operation or they're used by their operation. So I recommend that in order to come up with a number of how much the equipment actually costs per enterprise, you set up some sort of spreadsheet like this, which is what is the equipment that you're using. In my case, I'm using poultry pens, I'm using poultry waterers, and I'm using a processing equipment. So mine's very simple. I'm very low end. How much did each piece of equipment cost? how many years is that piece of equipment going to be used for? And then multiply that out by what % of that equipment is going to be used for this particular operation. For instance, my poultry pens, they cost me about $100 each to build. I figure they last about 8 years, but they're 100% for the broilers. I don't use them for the turkeys at all. So as I do that calculation, the number I come up with at the end is entirely, well, and then I'm going to divide it by 8 years, because that's the amount per year that I'm basically investing in that piece of equipment, or that piece of equipment is contributing towards my broiler operation. Does that make sense? Yeah. You can either figure that into the equipment, or you can put that in another place. So it would be a little bit complicated to put it in here, so I would actually just put that in somewhere else. Anything else about equipment? So if you have a tractor, and someone asked when I did this on Thursday, they said, well, how do you know the value of a piece of equipment? And that can be a sort of complicated question, because in an accountant standpoint, there's two different ways to look at the value of equipment. And one would be the cost of what you bought it for, and the other one is the cost of what it's worth today. Those can be two very different numbers. And you just have to decide which one you're going to use, and then just be consistent with that in all of your analysis that you're doing. And talk to a tax accountant if you want to understand why you might do it differently. We do talk about it in the book, and I don't have it right on the top of my head right now. That's my processing plant that you can see right there. Isn't that great, Tom? So then marketing costs. As I said earlier, you're going to want to do all of the production-related expenses independently. I only market through one stream, where I send out letters to my customers, they send me a deposit, I raise the poultry, and then they come and pick them up, and then they give me money. It's really a great system. I'd recommend it to everybody. But so I've got very simple marketing costs. If you have a multiple marketing venues, leave this out right now, put it on the bottom. Supplies are just anything else that you're going to be using that goes into the operation. Other is miscellaneous. Just anything else, like maintenance would go here, anything else that goes in. And then the last piece that we're going to look at is overhead. Overhead is a kind of controversial thing to look at. And actually, people were complaining, well, I don't have my numbers up here. People were complaining that I didn't put in enough for overhead on my farm. I think that's very common. Overhead are things that are having costs on your farm that aren't individually related to the production that you have. For instance, if you're raising vegetables, if you would own the farm, whether you were doing that particular production or not, you're going to have expenses. You're going to have a mortgage possibly. You're going to have taxes. You're going to have insurance. You might have electricity costs. Those kinds of larger things that are going to be background bills, whether you're producing dairy or whether you're producing sheep. Now, if you're doing dairy, you might have your electric bills are obviously going to be a lot higher than if you're doing vegetables. So it's okay if you want to lump all of those into this line, but if there's some that are very specific for an enterprise that you know they're specifically higher for that enterprise, you can separate them out. But in general, you can put a lot of things in this category that are somewhat consistent, and again, what you're going to do then is divide it per enterprise and say, of the total overhead on my farm, I'm going to say that 60% is going to go to my living and to because I rent a lot of my land. So I'm going to say my overhead, my mortgage, and that sort of stuff could be 60% that isn't even related to either of these enterprises. And then maybe 10% is related to the turkeys, and 20% is related to the broilers, and 10% is related to the sheep. And then you just split it out in that way.
When you determine your overhead and percentage going to each enterprise? You could have diverse operation, chicken, cows, and produce. How are you determining your percentage? Is it based on sales? Is it based on volume?
That's a great question, and how would you determine what percent to use? And the answer is that you can use whatever feels comfortable for you. There's no necessary standard for that. You could use expenses. I tend to use footprint, just because my poultry operation has a very small footprint. Well, actually, I can't really say that, because my sheep have a larger footprint, but it's a much smaller part of my intensity in the labor of my operation. So I sort of merge the two. But you could take expenses. That would be a pretty standard one, is the amount of the expenses that are going into that particular operation. Did you have a thought on that?
Well, we take our overhead and we do it as a percentage of the income.
The income, yeah.
Right, so that each enterprise, depending on how much they're making, is taking a certain portion of the overhead, because if not, then my smallest enterprise is sharing the same as the others.
Right. Yeah, just sit down and sort of figure out what makes the most sense. It could be the amount of labor. If it sort of depends maybe on what your limitations are as well. I guess income probably makes the most sense, that would be what it would be. Any more questions on that? For those of you that have specific operations, you might have other things that you would put in this line item. You want to include everything that you feel is an expense that is related to that. As you lie in bed in the morning or get up or at night or get up in the morning and you're lying there going, oh my God, that's right, I got this huge expense like organic certification, or paying the fee, the checkoff fee for my dairy herd or something like that. Just make sure that everything that goes in as an expense is going to be included there. Again, we didn't talk about income. This, for my purposes, again, I only have the one market, and so it's very simple for me. I could say, I know all the checks that came in that paid for my broilers, and I know all the checks that came in and paid for my turkeys. And so I did mine as an enterprise that included the marketing costs. If you have different marketing streams, again, you would want to split those out. And then at the bottom, you have a net income, which I've already paid myself for my labor here. And so the net income is the amount that's coming back to the farm above and beyond the time that I put in to produce that product. And that's, some people that's termed net profit. And that money can be used. As we went through this discussion on Thursday, somebody pointed out that there's some other intangibles that are actually background expenses, which your accountant is going to call depreciation, which is the devaluing of all of the assets on your farm as you're using them. And it might not look like things are getting used up, like I've got an 80-stanchion barn that looks like it's going to stand there for 100 years, but the tax person is actually devaluing that at a certain value. And there's some argument that you might want to put depreciation into your expenses, but you can also look at it that your net income is going back to reimburse for that depreciation. But if you're using that argument, you might want to do something like set aside a little savings account where you're taking some of that net profit and setting it aside to cover that depreciation as a replacement cost fund. Because you don't want to just say, aha, now I can go to, have fun in Bermuda and spend all that money, because that's leftovers. It's kind of leftovers, but it is money that you really want to think about as how are you going to use it to go back into the farm. So here's another example of an enterprise budget. This was done by one of my partners, Craig Chase, at Iowa State University. This one is looking at green beans. And the way Craig does it is he likes to do it by the bed. That's one way to do it. You can do it by the acre. You can convert your beds into acre. Craig is using standardized numbers here from a diversity of farms in Iowa. And so I think he did a really nice job. He itemizes things a lot more than I do. You can see he put seeds and all the different kinds of labor. And what he did is he did a total for the year for all the farms, and then he divided by the number of beds, and then he divided. So that's what he's got, is that he says it's 0.10 hours per bed to spread fertilizer. So it's kind of nice to do it at this level of detail because, and we'll talk in a minute about what you're going to use your enterprise analysis for. He separates the harvest, and then he's got ownership costs, which is what I called overhead, total costs, and then he breaks it out per pound produced, which is a nice number to have. And then he's got a total that per bed, he says you're going to make $140 on per season on your crop of green beans. Here's another example. This is, and we'll talk about this more a little bit later, but this is a farmer in Andrea Gunner, who's in British Columbia. So these are actually Canadian numbers. She's an ag economist, and she really likes numbers. You can tell. She likes a lot of detail, and the reason she did this is she was comparing two different things. She was considering making a change. So she did it one way, and then she put the change in, and she did it another way. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. So what can you get out of this information? Now you've done all this work, you've got this set of numbers, and some people are saying, well, I can't do this for everything that goes on my farm. I'm not going to do it for beets and for celery and for corn. And the idea is to do it for the most key operations on your farm. Do it for the ones that you sell the most of, that you think are having the largest impact either on your time or on your finances. And that's the place to start. Ideally, as many as you can do, it's the more information you have. But if you're only selling 25 pounds of celeriac every year, I don't think it's really worth your time to figure out how much money you're saving or losing on that. So one way to take this information and make it more useful is to use ratios. And what a ratio is going to do is it's going to take the numbers and compare them to each other within the information that you have, so that then you've got a piece of information that can be compared to what happened last year. It can be compared to what your neighbor is doing, or it can be compared to what the broader world is doing. And there's actually some standardized ratios that are printed out there in the world that you can compare yourself to, not so much for the kind of operations we have, but there certainly are for things like dairy farms and crop farms. There actually are some organic numbers that are out there now that we've got some examples of some in the book that are organic numbers from Minnesota. But one of the numbers that I liked to use, a ratio, is how much income do I have per unit? And so as I did the number, here I figured out that for my broilers I make $3.48 in profit per bird, and turkeys I make $8 per bird. And that's above what I pay myself for my time. I thought, well, that's pretty cool. You know, it looks like turkeys are a really better deal. Well, then I look at this and I say, well, how much of all the money that's coming in is actually going into my pocket? Of everything that's coming in, what percent? So this is the net income divided by the gross income. So remember, the net income, which I didn't talk about a lot, but that's the income, the gross income minus the expenses is the net income. And so here I can see, oh, you know, the turkeys made $8 each, but it's only 11%, whereas the broilers are 23%. And that's really interesting because here it looks like the broilers are really doing better for me than the turkeys are doing better for me. So that's why ratios are really better, because it gives you a more accurate picture of what's going on. Now here's the net income per hour spent. I thought this was really interesting. For my broilers, I'm actually getting $12.41 per hour above the $10 per hour that I did. So that's $22 an hour. That's pretty good. The turkeys, I'm only making $5.13 per hour because they take more time over a longer period. And the reason that I did this is I really had this bright idea that I was going to make more money if I growing turkeys than I was going to do growing broilers, and I was really going to convince all my customers to order more turkeys and discourage them from doing broilers. But I'm only making $15 an hour growing turkeys, and I'm making $23 an hour doing broilers. So I thought, wow, so much for that plan. But we're going to talk for a minute, in a minute, about the limitations of this. And one of the limitations that comes out very strongly in here is economies of scale. Because if you think about it, I raised 225 broilers and I only raised 17 turkeys. Well, if I was raising 35 turkeys, it probably wouldn't take twice as much time, but I would get twice as much money. And that's going to happen in all of your operations, is that there's going to be this balance. It's not going to be every time you double your production, it's going to take twice as much work. Sometimes, if you double your production, it's going to take twice as much work. There's an example that Chris gave in the book here where he went from raising 2 hogs to raising 8 hogs. And you can think, oh, that's not a big deal. But for him, because of fencing issues and feeder issues and water issues, all of a sudden when he went from 4 hogs to 6 hogs, he had to spend a whole lot more money in order to get those 6 hogs set up. And so it was not as cost effective for him to change from 4 to 6 as it was for him to change from 2 to 4. For all of your operations, there's going to be those cutoff points, and it's going to be different for each kind of production. And I don't know a lot about if that's written about in the media. You really have to kind of figure it out for your own, talk to other farmers. Where is this cutoff? When do you have to buy a tractor and the rototiller isn't as good anymore? Because that, all of a sudden, those overhead costs, if you leave your rototiller on the side of the road and you buy a tractor, all of a sudden these numbers are going to change dramatically because that overhead cost is really going to change a lot. Does anybody have any stories to tell about that? That's a really important factor to consider. But once you have this analysis, you can actually plug some of those numbers in and you can say, well, what happens if I buy a tractor? What is that going to do to this? And then all of a sudden you see, oh, well, because it'll change my productivity a little bit, things will bump up, but then as I start to utilize that tractor more and less percentage of it goes to this operation over time, things are going to change. So it allows you to just speculate what might happen in the future. So this is something else that my colleague Craig Chase brought in, which, again, these are standardized numbers, and it's really important for you to know that you can't just sit down and say, I'm going to make $36.47 if I plant asparagus. It's going to be different for everybody's farm. So again, these are numbers from Iowa. This is from 2006. They're standardized numbers. But one of the things that enterprise budgets are really useful for is to help you do product mix decisions. Because, and the stories that Craig tells about this is if you look at just the first column, you're going to say, what should I grow? If I've just got anything can happen, and everybody says, I'm going to grow heirloom tomatoes because I can make $547 a bed. These are per bed numbers. If I grow heirloom tomatoes. Well, isn't that a great idea? But then you look across and you say, yeah, but to grow heirloom tomatoes, I'm going to need 11.2 hours. But it's just me on the farm. And I don't know if I have 11.2 hours to put in. Maybe I should rather grow spring greens, which is listed under greens, because it's only going to take me 2.8 hours, and then I'm going to get $100 back. So you have to think about what the limiting factors are on your farm, and make a balance of things that take more time, bring in more money, things that take less time but will bring in less money. And again, this chart is on your handout, so if you want to just sit and study that. As you do your own numbers, things are going to vary this much, obviously. Some things are a lot more profitable than others. Any questions about that? Yeah?
One thing you didn't include is you don't necessarily have a market for all.
Yes. Yes, and we're going to talk about that. Right. And that's a huge assumption. This is just looking at the production costs. And you might not know how to grow it, and you might not have the infrastructure, and yeah, there's all kinds of things there.
Can you figure your own labor cost into the income tax? Give you $10 an hour for your bill?
It depends on how you're structured as a company. If you're, and I'm not a tax accountant, and so I'm going to be very cautious about how I answer that question. But yes, you can take a draw for yourself as a salary, and that can be counted. It depends, again, how you're structured. If you're an LLC, or you're an S corp, or you're a partnership, or you're a sole proprietorship. So, sorry to skate around that, but I don't want to get anybody into trouble. So again, we talked about the limitations here, the economies of scale, and the intangibles, which you just brought up, which is that just because you know that it costs you this much, and as you look in the literature, you could potentially bring in this much, that doesn't mean that market is out there. That doesn't mean there aren't other people that are competing, that are already filling that market share, and so don't make assumptions about that. Look at your labor and time balance. Everybody, you've got limitations on that level. Constraint of your equipment or your systems. If you've got a hoop house, you can't be growing 3 different crops in it at the same time. You've got to parcel out what's going to happen when you've got time. If you're deciding that you're going to plant both green beans and tomatoes, you've got to make sure that you plan to have the harvest on those at different times, so that that really labor-intensive work of picking green beans isn't going to be happening when you've planned to be making a big profit with another crop that takes a lot of labor. And just the benefits of product diversity on your farm. Think about, and I think that there's a lot of people talking about this weekend, is the benefits of having a very diversified farm and a lot of integrated systems that are working with each other. That's why we've all gotten into trouble with the monocrop system, is everybody says, oh, I penciled it out, and BH corn is going to be what's going to make me the most money, and so that's what I'm going to do. Well, we're not thinking that way. I don't want to encourage you to think that way. But yet, it behooves us to use our numbers so that we at least know what's going on, so that when we're making a decision, it's an intelligent decision. We're not making assumptions. Because I think it was easy, like me with my turkey situation. I just assumed I was making more money doing turkeys. Well, I'm not making more money doing turkeys. Yeah.
How many years data in figuring that out, like knowing that you want that kind of productive interplay between, several different, how long do you give it to figure out whether it's a good part of the mix or not, even if you have some crops that aren't, showing up on the balance sheet as really good producers?
Well, I'll talk about some of the ways to look at that in a little bit, but I think that's a very difficult question to answer, because it depends on the resiliency of your system and the resiliency of your resources and what your goals are really in the long run. If you really like beets and you really want to spend more time with beets, then you might give them a little more time than something that you don't like so much, like sweet corn, if you just don't like doing sweet corn. That's how I would approach it. So I don't think you can say cut and dried. I would say that's one that you would want to make with your gut, as long as it was supported by the numbers. Any other questions? So another really good piece of information you can get from an enterprise budget is where are most of my costs coming from? This is a really interesting thing to look at here. Obviously, in my operation, feed is by and far the largest input, by about 3 times. So if I did this and I came up with negative numbers at the bottom, if I needed to make a change, that's where I'd make my change. I'd figure out, how can I make this work better? I need to figure out how to get cheaper feed. Maybe if I was buying feed in bags, I would get feed in bulk. I'm feeding organic feed. I would have to make a decision. Oh, maybe for me, I would raise my prices, because I'm not going to give up on organic feed, but somebody else might not use organic feed if they wanted to keep the same prices, or something like that. Don't mess around with something like supplies. That's not going to change things very much. It might be really easy. maybe I could just use used twist ties or something. But that's not going to make a big difference. So don't fuss around with that. Now back to Andrea's example. She did a really interesting study, which is, again, she's up in British Columbia, and she had a really big problem with death loss. And she grows poultry like I do. These are Canadian numbers, so they are a little bit different. But she raises what she calls roasters, which are, I think, about 6-pound chickens, and she just sells them all into one market where people come in and buy them from her directly. And she had a huge death loss, and she's part of our poultry group, and so she learned through the conversation that there's this mineral that you can feed the chickens that really helps reduce death loss. But it's a mineral that's produced in New York, and it would cost her $50 a bag to buy the mineral and $10 a bag to ship the mineral. So she thought, well, if I bring this in, it's going to cost me more money, and is it going to be a cost-effective change? So what she did is she actually did a sample, a production year for a whole summer where she tried adding this mineral. This is from the Fertrell company. It's called the Fertrell NutriBalancer. And you can see it's on the, I don't have a pointer, but it's about 4 down or so on the top there, that she figured out that for a year's worth of, well, she did this, these numbers are by bird. So she obviously did a per flock, and then she just divided it out by bird, and that's what these numbers are here. So she spent 17 cents per bird, and because she did such a good job of tracking her numbers historically, she was able to compare what happened in 2010 with her average numbers from the previous 4 years. You can see here on the bottom that her costs with adding the mineral balancer actually went down. And the reason that they went down is that she not only lost fewer birds, but the birds ate less food. And she was so carefully tracking what was going on that she could very clearly see that. And she was sort of astounded. She had no idea that that would happen, because here she was sitting in her kitchen thinking, well, this is probably not going to work. It's going to be a bad idea. It's going to cost me all this money to bring this stuff in. But because she did such a good job of collecting her numbers, she decided to go with the change, and she made a bigger profit at the end of the year because she didn't reduce her prices to her customers. What a great example of how to use this. Now, she does not include labor in her numbers here, but for the purposes of this experiment, her labor was going to be the same. It wasn't really going to change by bringing in this mineral because she was having it mixed with the feed. So the fact that she doesn't include labor is important if she's making pricing decisions, but it's not important when you're doing a comparison like this. Yes?
What's the middle column?
It's for metric ton, Canadian. And then she took the numbers. You can see she's got what she calls, again, she's an ag economist, so she sells her birds for $3.95 a pound Canadian. The average cost, she calls it the average cost, but it's the average income that she gets per bird is $20.34. And then if you subtract $20.34, if you subtract the $10.50 or the $11.41, you can see she made a profit, a net profit of $9.85 with the NutriBalancer, and a profit of $8.93 without. So that she was really thrilled to find that, and I think that's a great example. So what else can we do? Pricing. This is, I think, one of the most important uses of this tool, which is that for my purposes, if you look at the net income, I can see, well, I am making a profit. My income minus my expenses, it is bringing back money back to the farm. So that's good. You always want it to be positive. And both of these, both my farm and the green beans, are making a profit. But there's a lot of things that go into making a pricing decision. And you always want your prices to be, at a minimum, covering your costs of production. And this might seem sort of stupid to say, but I think I can pretty easily say that for our types of farmers, probably 75 to 80% have no clue what their costs of production are. So if you have no clue what your costs of production are, how do you know that you're charging the right price? Maybe you still have money in your checkbook at the end of the year, but that's not knowing that you have the right prices. It's a good sign, but that's just a place to start. Yes. Oh yeah, there's a lot to go into it, and we'll talk about that some more. So, for me, my cost of production are $11.40 per chicken. That's what it costs me to produce my chicken. And my birds, I'm selling them for an average of $14.88 per bird, so that means I have $3.48 per bird net profit, which is a comfortable profit for me. Other people might want more.
Do you still apply that to your taxes? Because that's not in there, right?
The taxes aren't in there, and that's right. And the reason I hesitate is that my farm, this is such a small portion of my farm, and I have a very large infrastructure on my farm that I actually don't utilize, and I have a very savvy tax accountant that does really great things with depreciation. So I haven't paid farm taxes for years, even though I consider myself as making a profit in my farming operation. So that's a real complicated answer for a simple question. So again, Andrea is also making a profit. She's not including her labor, though. So when she says that she's making $9.85, she's considering that to go back to pay for her time. Now, hers are Canadian numbers, and I don't know what the exchange rate is today, but they are. So I think I'm making more money than she is. I haven't talked to her about that. But I really do recommend that you include labor. We're going to come back to some of the other elements of pricing, but a really important concept is the difference between fixed costs and variable costs. Now, fixed costs, again, are those overhead things. It's the price of the money that you invested in the tractor. It's your mortgage. It's your taxes. It can be labor if you're paying salaries to people, your utilities. The variable costs are the things that you're putting into your operation that change depending on how much you grow. For me, if I'm buying chicks, obviously if I raise more broilers, I'm going to pay more for chicks. That's a variable cost. For you, if you're planting more carrots, you're buying more carrot seed, that's a variable cost. The reason this is important is that if you do your enterprise analysis and it's negative, that tells you something. If you do your enterprise analysis and your expenses or your income is less than your variable expenses, and we'll look at my example in a minute, you're losing more money with every additional piece that you produce. And that is a complicated concept, but when you think about it, say for me, if I currently sell my broilers for $3.95 a pound, or what do we have them at? They're $10.50 a bird or something that I'm selling them for. If I only sold those birds for, let's go back to my example here. It costs me $11.40 per bird. That does have some overhead in it. Let's say it costs me $10 per bird, not including the overhead. So that's the chicks and the feed and my labor. If I'm only selling my birds for $8.50 a bird, every time I sell a bird, I'm losing, well, what did I say, $10, $8.50? I'm losing $1.50 every time I sell a bird. If I sell 4 birds, I'm losing $4.50. It's reverse logic, but it's so important. It's really important. And you're not only losing money, you're not investing anything back to keep the farm sustainable, to keep the farm going. Yeah.
So is there anywhere in here that you can incorporate like customer demands to figure out if you've got something with a loss leader and it's in the long run bringing a bigger consumer base to your farm, what that product might be, so you don't take it out just on the basis of
Yeah, that's going to be the slide that comes up where we talk about those other intangibles that are really important as part of your overall marketing scheme. Again, we're not going to go in depth about a marketing plan here, and so there are things like that are important, but you just have to know that that's what you're doing. Don't just do it because it.
How do you figure that?
What I would do is I would look at my numbers overall in my farm, and because you can do this for your whole farm. You don't have to just do it for one enterprise, and decide if overall all your numbers are comfortable for you. And if they're not, and you can say, and then you do your enterprises, and you can say, well, the tomatoes, we're really losing a bunch on the tomatoes. We knew we were losing money on the tomatoes because we know that's why people come here, but maybe we're losing too much on the tomatoes. Maybe we really need to raise that price a little bit or change the consumer perception or do something so that we can raise the price on those tomatoes. This is where it has to be a comfort thing, where if those tomatoes are dragging things down, like you're losing $2, well, you wouldn't lose $2, but say you're losing 50 cents a pound with every pound of tomatoes. Do you think you're getting 50 cents, or every time you go to the market, you figure out how many pounds you sell? Okay, we sold 50 pounds, and we're losing 50 cents a pound. That's $25. Are we getting $25 worth of value by those tomatoes dragging people to the market? I don't know. That's an intangible. There aren't, calculations that you can use to figure that.
I just wanted to add to that in our market, I think as long as you're comfortable with your overall margin and you know that that's a loss leader, then I think that's the most important number for us to look at the end of the day.
Right, the total. Right, but it's really good to have the basic information as long as you know that that's what you're doing.
Is it wrong on a loss leader to justify it by saying this other enterprise makes up this loss on my farm?
You mean to tie two things together?
Yeah. So, like, if you're losing the money on the tomatoes, but you're making it up in cut flowers, is it wrong to say that to justify that loss? You're not going down a slippery slope, are you?
The question is it wrong to justify by pairing it with another thing? I don't think that's wrong. Again, it's part of your marketing scheme that you're tying two things together. Look, we got lots of things. You had to.
I was just going to make the comment that if I have something like that I'm losing $25 on, but it's bringing customers to me, I write that off as advertising.
Very good. So there's a comment that you could write that $25 that you're losing into as advertising, and that's a really good point. Yeah.
But you have to consider is the customer coming in there, if that's the only thing they're buying,
right.
You just shot yourself in the foot.
Right. So if somebody is only buying tomatoes, then you're just losing money. Yeah.
I have one other comment about that, though. Nobody ever comes to a stand that there's nobody standing there. So if that gets somebody standing there, and all of a sudden somebody else sees them there, then they're going to come. That advertising is worth it.
Right. So
nobody comes to a stand when there's nobody standing.
You have to have a mile high or.
Yeah. So the importance of just having transactions it's a very delicate balance. I think that if I was losing $25 per market selling tomatoes, I think I would reconsider that myself. But that's just me. Was there another comment back here? No. Yes.
One thing you didn't include. Now, I understand your cost per unit that you're producing and your variable cost. Sometimes you can lower that variable cost by getting your volume up. So you can,
right.
You can get it a little higher. You can buy your seed cheaper, buy your chicken
right.
cheaper, or whatever.
Right.
So there's a fine line, and it's sort of like you had before about the law of diminishing returns. You make less on every unit, but also that kind of works in reverse at some points.
Right, and so the point is on the variable costs, there could be some volume considerations there. And I think that a really good example is labor, that somebody could be more efficient if they're walking out there to do some weeding or something. If you can keep them occupied for an hour, just the travel back and forth, you're getting more efficiency out of that person if they're there for 2 hours than if they're only there for an hour. Yeah.
Don't you think if you've got a product that's really not carrying its weight, that's, not even a break even, that you should rethink that product as maybe doing something value added with it so that you can make a profit on? Because I think eventually you continually have products that don't make any money or even lose money, then you're really going in a hole.
Right.
I really think that that you either have to break even or make something of it.
Yeah.
Because you're working hard for nothing.
Right. So the comment is that you really have to question whether you want to have products that aren't making any money, and I do agree with that. Because, and I think, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more at pricing, but I feel passionately that the consumers in the world, they want to support us. We've heard that over and over again at this conference. People like what we're doing. They want to support us. And if we've got a product out there that we're selling, and we're not even getting the cost that it costs us to raise that product, aren't we doing a disservice to that consumer? Because we're giving them the impression that they can get this really beautiful, for me, hand-raised chicken that I've put so much love and hard work into, and passion, and all of my reasons for being into. And if I can't get somebody to pay me $3.99 a pound, and I'm going to show you a slide here, I don't really want to sell to that person. I don't. If they're not going to really support what I'm doing, then they should go to Walmart, really. And I really believe that, yeah.
But therein lies the rub, right? Is that our culture has been artificially trained on lower, cheap food, right? So that's what we're all up against, is changing that perception.
Right. And so the point is changing the perception, and that's a huge job. It really is, and that's why it's hard. And I can sort of joke about how we all sort of withdraw from marketing. Many of us do. We're focused on the production, but it's so important for us to tell our stories and give that value, convey that value. It's a lot of work. It really is a lot of work. It's our main job. Yes?
And it's also important to note that your pricing also affects other farmers. If
Right.
you're coming in and just don't really
Undercutting.
know what the price is, and you do something super low, you're really doing a disservice to other farmers.
Right.
And
Right, so pricing below your costs, you're doing a disservice. So just here, my fixed costs, I tend to consider our overhead, equipment. And really, for me, that's my only overhead. I got such a low-end operation, it's kind of ridiculous for me to consider myself as an example, but it's nice and simple. So this is another interesting concept when we're thinking about pricing, and I don't know, this might be a little bit out of order here, but the retail industry has known for years that consumers, they get sort of blurry about prices. And I think we all know this when we walk into a store. How often do you see something priced at $2.67? You just don't see it. And as you look at this list, this has been very highly researched. And again, this is in your handout. And these are the price breaks that people notice or don't notice prices. And you'll see that people will notice $1.69, but there isn't anything between $1.49 and $1.69. So that what this means is that if you look at your cost of production and you think, well, $1.55 would be about a good price for me to charge given my cost of production. This chart is telling me that there's no reason you should charge $1.55, because if you charge $1.69, you're going to get exactly those same consumers coming and buying your product, and they're going to give you that extra 14 cents. And so why not go ahead and make that extra 14 cents? You're not going to sell any fewer products at $1.69 as you are at $1.55. And this is research, and I just think it's fascinating. And but I just priced my book at $19.95, so look at me, you know. Yes.
I just want to know, at farmers markets, people have like 20s and they have 5s and they have 10s. They really want to pay $4.99 and get a penny back.
Yeah.
I
So.
feel like they like looking at that.
Yeah. So the point is even numbers at a farmer's market. And I think that's a really good point, is that in distinct markets, your numbers, this is, again, the retail industry. So you might have a little bit different cutoff points, but so, yeah, maybe your number is $1 and not 75 cents. again, a lot of these things have come up. This isn't a talk about marketing, but of course marketing is going to come in and pricing is going to come. These are all the different important things you need to consider when you are setting your prices. In my mind, your cost of production is your very lowest price you're going to charge. That's the whole reason you're doing this analysis, so that you know what the lowest price is that you should charge. But the other things that you need to bring into consideration is, how does your customer value your product? And what can you do to change the way your customer values your product? We all know these, what's it? I was trying to think the other day about that online company that sells like those steaks, like no-name steaks or something. Here are these people, they're going out and they've got this product that's absolutely no better than anything any of us are producing, but they've created this name and this aura, and if you buy this, you're going to be a better person sort of thing. That's our job. That, if you want to start charging a higher price, or you feel you need to charge a higher price, it's that customer perception that comes in. And then the other one is competition. Who is it that you're actually competing against? When I grow my chickens, am I competing against the Walmart $69 or 69 cents a pound chicken, or am I competing with my neighbor who's also growing free-range poultry but isn't doing organic? And yes.
I think it's also important you go around and check your competition out. Like,
right.
we go and look at the grocery stores and see what they're pricing from the high-end grocery store to the low-end grocery store.
Yeah.
And then get online and look at some of the free-range people doing what they're doing. Well, it's for meat products. I mean, I don't
right.
know about vegetables, but...
I learned this at the last conference. I know, I'm in Maryland. And Giant Food has Pasa, which is an online buy.
Oh, yeah, online, yeah.
If you download that with your smartphone, you can check the prices while you're at the farmer's market, rather than having to go to the grocery store.
Yeah.
It's not.
Yeah. So the point is made about going out and checking what the competition is doing. Well, we've got to go on because we could spend a lot of time talking about marketing because there's so many considerations. But I really want to make this point, is that if you underprice below your cost of production consistently, you will go out of business, unless you have an off-farm job like me and that you support your farm as a hobby. But again, that goes back to that first slide and the point that you don't want to, you owe it to your customers to give them prices that allow you a sustainable farm. I really think that that's the bottom line. Yes, sir.
I think something to add to if you were to go through this whole process and do your cost-based pricing, you were really confident that this is what it costs you to make this product. At a farmer's market, I think you could pass that along. You could say, here's how much it costs to produce this, that's why I'm charging it. That's a really good thing to say to your customers. If they support you, they'll say, great. Your carrots cost that much to produce.
So the comment is that advertising that you know your cost of production and that that's what you've got and that your customers will support that. And that goes down to this bottom one is if your customers don't like the price you need to charge, get new customers. And people laugh about that. But when I first started, I was that kind of shy farmer. Oh, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not sure and so I was charging real low. And I got this loyal base of customers, and I got really nervous because I realized I was not making my cost of production, and I had to raise my prices. The first year I raised my prices 40 cents a pound, which I thought was astronomical, and I was debating, should I tell them? Should I make this big thing? I decided not to tell them. I sent out the forms. They came back. They pay absolutely no attention to the price that I'm charging. They just talk and they write checks. I've got customers, they buy 40 chickens at a time. They're paying $800 for my chickens. They don't care if it's $800 or $900. If I went on to $1,200, they probably would start to notice. But they support what I do. They want me to be there next year and produce a product for them, and they're going to pay me what it takes. And I just think that's a really important thing to think about, and that don't feel embarrassed. I was feeling embarrassed, and I know there's other people out there that are going to feel that way, and it's stupid. It's just stupid. Sir.
I was going to say I kind of have been there. Where I feel embarrassed and I'm growing heirloom tomatoes and charging $3.50, $4 a pound. People come up and they're like, to choose out 2 tomatoes and it's $9, and they're really surprised, and I'm like, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I guess just more harsh.
Yeah, well, you just be proud of what you're doing. That's the thing, and that we're all doing some really special things. We got to be proud about it. And people We know people out there like what we're doing. We keep hearing that. When I first started, the message wasn't as strong, but it's pretty strong right now.
Yeah, just to echo that on the meat side, I went through that in my head every time we wrote an even number. When the pork went above $4, I thought it was going to be the end of the world.
Yeah.
Nobody cared.
Yeah.
And the lamb went above $5. I thought I was going to screw up our whole business. Nobody's batted.
Yep. Yeah. So again, reinforcing the point of pricing. So just the last point I want to make is that you can also utilize this tool to just do these kind of quick and dirty assessments if you want to compare making a change on your farm. And the example, this is a Craig Chase example from Iowa State University, which he was saying, okay, you're going along and you're thinking, I'm not really making enough money growing green beans. What would happen if I was to grow salad instead in that same bed of what I was doing green beans? So he introduced me to this concept, which is once you've done your enterprise analysis on the green beans, you can do a very simple speculative enterprise analysis on the salad greens, and then you can sort of compare what would happen if I switched over to doing salad greens. So the way he set this up is that you just compare what would change. Okay, how much more money would I bring in if I had a bed of salad greens? And how much more energy or more inputs or less inputs? And as he did this, he would say, well, it's going to take more labor to you're going to have less labor to do the salad, and you're going to have more... I do get confused with these things. You're going to have more labor, you're going to have less income. So that actually, in this example, it wouldn't make sense financially for you to change to salad greens. It might make sense for other reasons, again. And you'd have to do a full enterprise analysis to see if you're still going to end up with a positive number on your salad greens.